I spent the majority of my formative years within the conservative Mennonite church. The Mennonites actually came first before the Amish, and they really nowadays would say that they split over shunning. So Mennonites still have a very mission-driven service into the world, so they love to convert people. They say they do. They do a lot of mission work. They go out into the world, much like you see in the Protestant churches. The Amish don't. If you notice that they keep to themselves, they really are not trying to actively engage with people coming into their communities. So that is like one of the fundamentals. The other is that the conservative Amish don't believe in assurance of salvation. So they believe in a faith that works. The Mennonites do. They do consider themselves, for the most part, Christians. So they would believe that once you are baptized, as long as you stay in good standing with the church, that you have eternal salvation. I actually grew up in Northern California in a secular/atheist home. And yet in the early 90s, there was this really big movement, which we see kind of being mirrored today with the trad wife movement, where people are wanting to go back to more traditional values. And so this showed up in a way in Northern California where people were pulling and extracting their children out of public school and starting to homeschool them. Like I said, much like we see what's happening today. The difference is that social media didn't exist. So you were not able to connect with people that were like-minded unless you went into more extreme cults. And so because of that, with this homeschool movement, there were not a lot of publications being produced for textbooks. So there were primarily 3, one which was a Becca. The other 2 were primarily produced by Amish and Mennonites. So whenever they started sending out these textbooks into our area, they noticed that there was a large desire for people to entrench themselves in a more fundamentalist Christian approach, not only with just schooling, but also in a lifestyle. So my family is one of the original families that brought Mennonites to California. I believe now there's 8 churches that are throughout Northern and Southern California. But yeah, so at 9 years old, it was really this pivotal moment and shift where we went from just kind of tiptoeing into more fundamentalist lifestyle into actual conservative Mennonitism. It just really segued, much like you were going down a slope, the slippery slope. So at that point, I was very excited because it felt fun. I was not going to public school. We were having all of these really cool homeschool movement meetups and different types of community efforts, and it felt fun at 9. But by the time I was 14 and we moved to a more conservative church in the Midwest, things became so much more complex and it became a lot more legalistic. What I've found is that people that are joining into the Anabaptist churches are oftentimes coming from a dysfunctional family unit themselves. And so they are trying to model something for their children. So I think that a lot of parents that are moving in are actually genuinely wanting to have a better life for their family. Nobody's really saying, yes, cults are us, let's go, right? The problem is that as you get thicker and thicker into it, you're losing your reality of what you used to have, and it makes it harder to pull out. And then there's this desire to prove yourself that you are the most worthy to be accepted into this community. So most of our families that have joined in became ultra conservative as a way of trying to prove that we were worthy of being in good standing within the church. So my parents choosing to go to a more conservative church absolutely makes sense if you look at the wavelength of people that will go into even more conservative churches. It was fascinating at that point between 14 and then when I left at 18, because my parents were they all of a sudden became super controlling over me, and the church was becoming controlling. And because I was such a threat, we were the first family to ever join our church where we were at, coming from the outside. I was this shiny new object that was so threatening to the ministry. And because all the girls, they were fascinated with me because I had outside information and I had had this previous life. And now here I was in the community. While I was a threat to the ministry and to the men in the church, it was very much like I was this unique person to my peers. We had a small group of girls, probably around 10 of us total, within a 9th and 10th grade. And so how the church really splits girls up is once you become a church member, then all of a sudden you're considered pretty much like you're from 15 on in a different category. And so there was a large amount of us that were around that age group. And whenever I moved, I'll never forget, like before we even moved, I had all these letters written to me by these girls and they were so excited that I was coming. And so I was really initially accepted into the girls group there, but that lasted probably 3 months before suddenly the parents started forbidding the girls to associate with me outside of school. I was not invited to any of the family functions. There were only 2 primarily families in the entire church. And so the girls ended up turning on me. And so in my journal entries that I have, at one point I was questioning that they were intentionally leaving me out of things because it was so hurtful, which they were, right? Whether or not it was their parents' influence, it was like Lord of the Flies in a sense. And so I was wearing the Scarlet A and I hadn't really done anything except existed in how I was. And so it was very confusing. I mean, I feel like being a teenager is confusing in itself. And then you add this component of trying to fit into this world that you're never gonna be accepted in, but I didn't know that. So I tried so hard. And then it made things worse because then the ministry was saying that I was trying to one-up the girls by wearing thicker socks or a more conservative head covering than the other girls. And I was trying to make myself stand out. So it was really difficult. And at that point, you just start shutting down because if you cannot succeed in this at all, I mean, what's the point, right? So that phase of like between 16 and 18 was extremely lonely because I had been completely isolated. I was not invited or allowed to any function. And I was under the microscope of the ministry the whole time. And I just truly wanted to fit in and be accepted. At 14, if you're joining into the church, you are then considered an adult. So it takes away all of your childhood. But so at that phase, you go from wearing braids into wearing your hair up and then wearing a head covering. And so whenever I wanted to fit in, right? So I stood up during revival service and I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I then went through a period of instruction class. Much like Catholicism, they put you through instruction class for a year. But you put your hair up into a head covering. So I had mousy brown hair. I had it slicked back. I had a little bit of the fundamental, I call it the fundy sweep, you know? It's like you got that perfect little poof. Problem is that I have a cowlick in the back of my head. And so my hair back here swoops as well. And the amount of meetings that the ministry had with me because they felt like I was intentionally leaving wisps of hair out then led me to start shaving like any flyaways at all because I was under an Aquanet. Oh my God, the way that we would use Aquanet, it was like we were armadillos. You could just like bounce something off my hair. But I started really starting to pull my hair out. This is the first sign of really starting to lose some of my mental health. I was starting to pull my hair out because it was causing so many problems in ministry meetings. But yeah, so I had the little fundy swoop, I had my head covering, I wore my strings. For us, we could only have material that was the print size on our dresses had to be less than a quarter. So whenever we fabric shopped, I had to take a quarter with me. The flowers and the leaves had to fit within that circular 25-cent quarter piece. And so you could wear certain colors. But I had to be careful because we have a standard book that tells you what you can and cannot wear. But there's a gray area. And if you're constantly being looked at by the ministry, you have to really be careful. And so pink was not allowed with some of the family members because it was diluted red. So, and red is not allowed, obviously. And so I had a few pink dresses, but everything was just very floral. So I began to start wearing solid colors and lengthening my hem almost to my ankles, just to avoid any sort of ministry meetings. You have to wear 30 denier socks, and so, or opaque, but I tried to sway towards the opaque side of things just once again to avoid the ministry. And then there were minister meetings because I was trying to be too conservative. You have to wear a belt. You cannot wear, you have to have 3/4 length sleeves. Your ruffles have to be less than 1/4 of an inch. You cannot show your elbows because elbows look like nipples. You cannot drive a dually truck because that also looks like women's hips. Black vehicle. We had to cut off our antenna in case the world saw an antenna on the car and thought that we would be listening to the radio. We had no access to musical instruments, nothing. Keep in mind, my family, like the whole time we're in the church, I didn't know the reference of this song, but my dad would constantly sing, "Paint it black," right? I see a red door and I want to paint it black. Like that song was literally written about conservative Mennonite women, I'm convinced, because everything had to be this color. So I had to wear a belt at all times. The ministry and men would drive by our house just to make sure if I was outside hanging clothes on the line that I was wearing a belt and that I had stockings on. If I didn't, I would be called into a meeting. And so all these meetings were really linked into my membership. So you're in a trial period, right? Whenever you're in instruction class. And then they have these council meetings. And the members of the church vote on you if they feel like you are deemed worthy to be a member of the church. Keep in mind, you can't be baptized unless you are. So all of these legalistic standards and everything, and you're trying to maintain this imagery, is really so that you can maintain your salvation or that you can be baptized and saved. So it's less about the clothes and more about salvation, right? So all of a sudden salvation is tied to what kind of pins you have in your belt, and if you're wearing your belt, and if if your sleeves are the right length and everything. And so it can really muddy the water about salvation and compliance. You can sexualize anything. If one thing that I took away from the church is that they sexualize absolutely everything. I mean, have you ever looked at an elbow and been like, yeah, that looks like a nipple. That checks. I'm gonna buy that gal a drink. Absolutely not. Like, who wants to look at an elbow, right? They can be ashy, they're weird, they get in the way. And so, growing up, my mom used to use this analogy, and I think it still relates. When you have a tube of toothpaste, toothpaste is meant to be used. And you're supposed to take the top off, and when you squeeze, a little bit comes out, and you go along your merry way, right? That is pretty much our sexuality, how we look at things. The problem is in these insular communities, like the Mennonites and Amish, is that they're scared to take the top off because they have never learned self-control. And so you're taught that, oh, if the top of that toothpaste comes off, it's gonna get everywhere, right? And so we can't do that. But our natural urges are still there, our desires to be loved and our desires for sex, all of these things. So that's gonna be naturally squeezed. But what happens is if you got the tube so tightly wound at the top, but it's still naturally being squeezed, it explodes. And that is how I look at sexuality. And I think that's why we have such an abuse problem within the communities too. Because they don't teach the children and they don't teach the men and they don't teach the women anything about sex. And so they don't know how their bodies work. They don't know what is consent, what isn't. And so it's exploding everywhere. I've asked my Instagram audience a few times, like, at what age were you first aware that you were being sexualized? And for me, I think I was sexualized around the age of 10. I mean, if you think about how they make you cover up as a girl, and all of a sudden it's that purity culture shame woven into it, and plus then you're developing as a young woman, so that you're already kind of a little uncomfortable about it. But yeah, they'll start sexualizing you at a very young age. Through their propaganda, they have all of their reading materials meant to, the first one, there's a series that is very common to be distributed. They're called the sacred subjects. And the first one is issued to girls. It's titled A Girl of 11. And in there, it talks all about your responsibility for maintaining your own purity. And if your brother rapes you, that it is your fault because you were not wearing the appropriate clothing, or that you were laughing too loudly, or that you were walking you're supposed to walk in a certain way. Your body language is supposed to be very shut down. And that's a girl of 11. I think that there is this romanticism that we see from people on the outside looking at the communities and in general. And I'm always very intrigued why. Because I think that if you look at how people perceive the plain and simple and gentle people, it's almost like we have such bias towards them, right? That surely they could not hurt anybody. And yet also we look internally at the brand, the Amish and Mennonite brand, which have done such a good job of not only looking aesthetically pleasing, but playing into that, where we keep sweet, right? The women talk very softly and sweet and very sing-songy, and you sing along whenever you're doing your household chores, and it's all this, illusion into the fact that it's very simple and the women are stupid in a way. And so we have to treat them very tenderly. So there's no way that all of this horrific amount of abuse is happening to these tender people, when in fact, that's all a ruse, but they're playing into it. So when we look at the abuse within the Amish and Mennonite and Anabaptist churches, it's oftentimes compared to the Catholic Church. But I always say it's far worse, because the Catholic Church is known for one thing, which is sex abuse. But the amount of abuse that's happening is not just limited to childhood sex abuse within these cultures. We have trafficking, you have domestic violence, you have financial abuse, religious abuse, you have kidnapping, you have drugging women. I mean, it's just like this conglomerate. So instead, looking at abuse within these communities, I often say you should look at it as a wheel, right? So each of these are components, they're spokes on the wheel, and it's moving the systemic issues forward. So it's hard to dismantle that belief system that abuse is maybe, but my neighbors are so nice, they would never have that happen. But the amount of people the amount of your neighbors that I've actually heard horror stories from would just, I think, blow the regular person's mind. But I also want to hone in on the fact that there's still, when we look at the abuse in the communities, maybe we have an understanding. Maybe after hearing me speak, you'll be like, next time you'll see an Amish person or a Mennonite person, you'll be like, there's abuse happening in there, and it's high. There still is that separation where there's not that component that will kick in that says, there's abuse happening in that community, and this is a community member of mine, and they could actually come for my children. But that happens. But we still want to keep it isolated, right? We still want to think that the abuse is only happening within the communities, and it's not. What is keeping that from happening and penetrating over into the other communities? So when I talk to people and they, at first, are very challenged with dismantling the belief and the narrative that their kind and gentle neighbors would never do that, maybe I can get to them to understand that, hey, yeah, it's happening. And it could also happen to your children or your family members if you don't hold them accountable as well. So it's a bigger issue than just what's happening within the communities. It's also a safety concern for community members as well. I truly am the only person that is doing what I'm doing right now. Now, I have a few other advocate friends that are working on other areas of fighting this abuse. But as far as I know of, I'm the only person that is not only putting out content, which I really have taken away from. I have not had the space to be able to put out free content to educate because I've been so immersed within the communities. So I'm back in the churches, back in the communities, traveling literally all over the US, interviewing women, taking down their stories, documenting what is happening, going through all of these papers that are penetrating in through the restoration teams and through the communities. Primarily, I have women that are reaching out that don't know what to do with the levels of abuse that's happening, or maybe they don't even know that there's abuse happening, but somebody within the community told them about me. Why is it me? Because I grew up in the church. And so whenever I sit down with these current members within the community, there is a sigh of relief, literally, whenever they realize that I understand the dogma that they're being taught and that they are living in, and they don't have to explain any of the cultural nuance. They don't have to explain what the ministry is saying or all of the mechanisms that they use in order to control these women. They literally will say, oh, you get it. Yes, I get it. I do get it. And I want you to get that it is a crime, because they don't know that. So I'm in this really unique position to be able to validate what is happening with them. And because of that, trust is built. And once you're in, then there's just a network of these women that then I'll have somebody reach out to me because somebody met with me and they felt like I was a safe person, and so they'll reach out and share their story. So collectively, what I started doing was trying to figure out what the crimes were, what was happening, so that way I could not only on the outside build out what support system that they need, but also take it to a federal level and have a federal investigation opened into these churches. So I've met with judges, I've met with the prosecutors in different counties, I've met with local law enforcement, trying to help them understand the cultural nuances and the cases that are in their communities and not being reported and how they can assist them. I've met with the Bureau of Criminal Investigations, Homeland Security, and so now I have the support of federal agents that are trying to help me as I move through the communities to get women comfortable and educated enough to report what's happening. So if I had the chance to sit down with somebody that is still in a high control, high demand religion, which I do on a daily basis, what I want them to understand is that their intuition is valid and they're always right. I've yet to have somebody that comes to me and says, I think something may be going on in our community. There may be something, but then they'll try to downplay it. They're always right. Their instincts are right because we know that this is shit, that we know that this is crime. And so I want people that are still in these communities to understand that they're not wrong and that what is happening in a great capacity, and that it is challenging to come forward and talk about it, but that there are people on the outside that truly care and want to support them as they move and navigate through what it would look like to either leave the church or to stay in. Regardless, they deserve safety.